Hi, Simon.
Hi, Lisa.
You were telling me that you've started playing around with some other AI tools. No, maybe not the tools, but so you had some interesting use cases of using AI in your work.
Yeah, so
Do you want to
I do
tell?
I do some volunteer work. Two things maybe. I do some volunteer work where I help with mock interviews, giving people a chance to practice the skills of learning to do an interview, be comfortable, answer tough questions. But what I do is I've been using AI, and I have a prompt that I wrote that says create interview questions using this attached job description or uploaded job description, and be sure to talk about background, gaps in work history, and ability to get transportation to and from the job
Mm,
site and things like that. And
hmm.
so there's some other parameters in there, and it's fantastic. Like, saves me so much time, and it generates a decent set of questions, and then I usually don't obviously use them all. But it really helps, like, have the questions be, especially behavioral ones, like describe a situation where you had to
Mm,
work with a team member, and it's usually related to the particular job description that I uploaded. So it could be something like working in manufacturing, working in outside sort of construction type roles, things like that. So
mm.
that's one. The other thing that AI is super helpful is summarizing really long videos.
Yeah.
I do grant writing, and I found this. I had to watch a 2.5 hour council meeting, and I'm like, I am not watching a recording of a council meeting for 2 hours. And I basically was able to use two different AI tools, one that extracted the transcript of the whole meeting, which wasn't
Mm-hmm.
perfect, but it was pretty close.
Mm-hmm.
And then I used another AI tool to give me a summary of specifically the area that I was interested in, the topic about grants. And it was like, and then I could go back in the video and listen. Like,
Yes.
it wasn't
Where is
about
it?
trusting AI to summarize it completely. It was really about like waypoints, and helping me find the information and then be able to go in, and then I listen to it. Because the thing that you don't get from text, as we all know, is you don't understand the sort of person's passion, the intent. You don't get
Mm,
any inflections from their voice. There's no body
mm-hmm.
language, right?
Mm-hmm.
Think about those emails that were sent innocently, or maybe with a little bit of sarcasm, and somebody took it the wrong way because
Yeah, it's
they didn't
true.
understand where you were coming from. Same with listening to feedback on a proposal or something like that. So
Mm-hmm.
it's very, very helpful at taking care of like things that could be arduous and repetitive and very menial. It gives me a chance to have time to like think about the actual concept that's being presented, or the need or whatever, and then
Mm-hmm.
structuring an appeal around that.
That's great. And it's kind of segues into what we're going to talk about today. My dear friend, Kelly Garneau, that we had referenced before in another episode. She teaches English at Northeastern University. Let's take a listen. I am so excited for our guest today. So, we're going to be meeting with a good friend of ours. As we talked about in a previous episode, I mentioned that I have this friend that works at Northeastern University, and she teaches English and has opened up the conversation about AI. So, we're going to be talking to Dr. Kelly Garneau, who is a teaching professor and the global coordinator for the writing program at Northeastern University. She teaches first year writing and advanced writing in the disciplines. She received her PhD from Northeastern University, which is when I met her. I think she was working through her PhD at that time, specializing in modernist American fiction, especially the role of technologies as models of memory and identity. These interests persist in a fascination with the ways the tools we use as writers shape how we express and even know ourselves. Kelly's academic interests include online and hybrid course design and delivery, student-centered assignment development, and exploring the factors that influence students' confidence and identities as writers. She has served on several panels and inquiry groups related to the impact on AI in writing instruction and students' development as writers. And as I mentioned, I've known Kelly for a very long time. She's a dear friend of mine, and we are very. And then we're. I know you had listened to the episode where we referenced you, and so I almost even want to just touch on that. That if you can remember the conversation that you and I had, 6 months ago or so, where just give a little bit of that background on how you approach AI in your classroom, and maybe give the context of the students that you're talking to, and how, just to kind of ground us a little bit.
So that's actually like a big question. I was laughing because I remember the conversation so vividly, and you remembered it really well. Like it was funny to hear myself referenced in a podcast, and I was like, oh, no, that is exactly what we were talking about. I think the question we were talking about at the time was, how do we engage students with the concept of AI? And it was actually, I think, longer than 6 months ago. It wasn't super long after ChatGPT had sort of exploded,
Right.
and suddenly everybody was talking about it. And as a writing instructor, because one of the fundamental purposes of ChatGPT is to write, this was like everyone was sort of freaking out. How is this going to impact writing? How's it going to impact our students? What are we going to do? And we were having a lot of conversations around that. So you and I were talking about, how does that look in the classroom? And I think that's both something that depends on the students and where they are in their relationship to ChatGPT, and literally where they are in their academic journey, and then also the class that I'm teaching. So I teach these two very different classes. One is first year writing. So I'm meeting students right when they come into the university. And then I'm also meeting students much later in advanced writing in the disciplines, where students are writing in the ways that they're going to write in their field. So it's much more focused on, I most often teach one in the health sciences. So
Oh,
it's, nurses and physical therapists and folks who are going to be working in healthcare, and how do they write. So they're very different classes, very different points in time. And it's changed because the technology is changing so fast. The questions are also changing so fast. So, I mean, my most recent first year students came in very, like, they're coming out of high schools where they've been told, do not touch this.
right.
This is cheating. You're never going to be prepared to face the world if
Yeah.
you engage with this. So starting the conversation with them is sort of starting from, where are you? What have you heard? What have you played with? What have you done? And then with the older students, a lot of it is more, how are you using it? Like
Yeah.
in
Right.
your work, in your
Adopting it.
workplace. Yeah. Where is this coming into play? And for business students in particular, um, it's used a lot, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's not something you can kind of say, don't touch this.
Well,
Right.
how did you introduce it? So, and can you remind me of the prompt that you usually use? This is where I could not remember it exactly, but it was ambiguous. And this is actually, I don't think it was in writing. This was more in the
Right.
image generation prompt. So I think those are two different questions, actually. But so how do you get started, I guess, is the first one, and then we'll talk about the prompt later.
So I'll talk about the first year writing first. And one of the things that I do is I do play with image generation, right? And
Mm-hmm.
part of that is because that I think they worry that I'm like, sort of the cop in the room, and if they
Mm.
start
Mm-hmm.
playing with the text-based thing, it's going to be problematic. So we'll have an assignment that has something to do with visuals, and we'll use one of the tools to create visuals. And I think the one you were referencing was, I had asked them to create prompts, and that's one of the things that gets really interesting, is how do you learn to create a prompt that will get
Right.
the tool to do what you want it to do, right?
Yeah.
So my students were playing around with just whatever they could think of. And at the time, we were playing with DALL-E.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my students put in the prompt, um, draw me a panda playing baseball with a fish in a cyberpunk style. And it created this super groovy image of a panda swinging a bat. at a fish that was now the ball that was flying, and it was really cool. But it was interesting because we started thinking about the prompt could have meant so many different things.
Right.
The fish wasn't another player, which is what I think he intended, a panda playing baseball with a fish.
Yep.
Instead,
But this is where I thought bat exactly,
Yeah,
but it was but it interpreted as the ball.
Yeah,
but it could have been the bat.
Yeah, it could have been the bat, and it leads to all sorts of really interesting questions right away about how do you write something, how do you then tweak that prompt so it does something else, how do you write in a way that the tool is going to give you what you want. And it also raised immediately sort of interesting ethical concerns. Like one of my students came up with something that was really, thought it was pretty groovy, and he was like, can I sell this? Can I like put this on a t-shirt?
Interesting.
And so you immediately sort of find yourself in that area of, is this mine if I created it in conversation with one of these tools?
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I imagine, I like the fact that you sort of approach this by not being the cop, right? And sort of, unfortunately, you have to sort of undo that thinking, I imagine, right, with your students, and get them to be comfortable, but understand the sort of guardrails that are required to use it.
Yeah, and the guardrails, I mean, that's almost a whole other topic, but the guardrails are really hard to define. So that's a really important area. Also with the first year students, I sort of start from a place of, we're going to do this together. We're going to, and I think I play with the visual in part because I'm terrible at it. Like,
and so for reference, Kelly's husband and brother-in-law are illustrators. Like they both can do, and mother-in-law, draw really well. So she's surrounded by these people that are very good at that.
Awful. No skill. So for me, I can go into it and I can be like, okay, let's play with this. And we're all on at least a level playing field. They're probably better at it than I am. And I tried to play with Firefly recently with my students because it's
part of
available to them as part of the Adobe. I couldn't do it. Like all of us, we were struggling so hard because it required a little bit of Adobe knowledge to really
interesting.
be able to use it effectively.
We'll have to tell our friend who's
we'll give
product
feedback.
marketing manager.
I wanted it to work so like intuitively, and we were like, wait, what do you do? So I start from that place where I don't know at all like what we're doing, but then we also talk a lot about what the rules are and how the rules around what's allowed shift literally they do shift from institution to institution. They shift within our institution from classroom to classroom because the overarching policy is essentially that it's cheating if it's not sanctioned.
Right. That makes sense.
But that means a lot of pressure on the students to figure out when it's sanctioned, when it's not. Are the rules clear? So in my first year classes, we will often develop our own policy together.
That's cool.
Sort of work through like, when do you think it's helpful for you? And we have to build a little trust for them to, be like, okay, yeah, I use it when I brainstorm, or I use it when I, can't think of ideas, and then talk about the places where it makes sense and places where it might get in the way of them developing the skills that they're going to need.
So then for the other students who maybe are, they had already had some level of, writing in high school. They never had this crutch of AI. Right. So how are you talking to them about it? And when is it okay for writing? Like, do you encourage any, I don't know, ideation or anything like that?
Well, I think that for the students who, it's interesting because for the students who are a little bit older, it almost goes in both directions. Some of them are very suspicious of it. That it's interesting. Like it's something that's going to really undercut their ability to do the work that they're going to have to do. they're all in different places, just like we are. So some of them are
Yep.
really suspicious of it. Some of them have been, say, on co-op, and they've gone on co-op and they've discovered that the place they work uses, their own proprietary AI. So
Mm-hmm.
it's important for them to understand how to use it in a way
Right.
that's effective. Um, and then, like all of us, I think some of them are using it to be more efficient. They have a lot on their plate and they want to try to do things faster, and they want to try to do things um, that they care about, and maybe outsource things that they don't care about as
I mean,
much.
that's sort of my take on it. I have a daughter who recently graduated from college and works in the entertainment industry. And she's just, at first, she was like, "Oh, AI is terrible. Why do you use that? Blah,
Mhm.
blah, blah." And I'm like, well, because it takes all these tactical, sort of mundane, repetitive tasks and lets me
Right.
focus on being more strategic and innovative. And doing the other stuff is like, it just frees up time and sort of brain power, I guess. And I also said, I think good's going to come of it. It's interesting because we were talking about policies, and even this very big entertainment company has a team of people now dedicated to incorporating AI appropriately in their entertainment space and in the work that they do and the output that they create. So,
Yeah, and I think that that appropriately is the big question, right? Like,
right.
sort of, when does it make sense? When does it short circuit things? And it's never easy.
And it's
I'm
always
I'm
gray.
Yeah.
I have a little
Oh,
sidebar thing. This is what Simon and I do. If we have a little sidebar, it's a
sidebar
little
marketing.
Ready.
tangent in our brain. Well, this is actually, it's a personal thing when you just said it's appropriate. I remember you telling me with your first daughter, you went swimming in Walden Pond and you said, don't go too far. She waded out and then she was up to her waist or something. And she turned to you and said, is this an appropriate level for me to be? And she's like, however old she is. But I remember you telling me that. Is this appropriate? And I was like, great use of the word. She's
Good
probably,
vocabulary.
I don't know how old she was, but enough that she could go swimming by herself, but young enough.
That you were
Okay.
surprised
And
she understood the concept of that
well, I'm
word,
not
right?
Yeah.
surprised because
Oh, with
Kelly
her
is a great
parents. Okay.
with her exactly very good vocabulary, so it's not surprising. But I just had a little memory. Okay, so end sidebar. But I do have a question about
Mhm.
you are also part of the administration, right? With planning and things like that. Do you foresee that you guys are going to have a dedicated, writing for AI or anything like that specific, or is that not within your department necessarily? Maybe it's going to be in the business school or something like that.
I mean, I think there's a lot of things coming our way. I don't. I will say that I do foresee that. I don't have any idea what the timeline for that will be. I
Yeah,
think
seems
that
imminent.
AI can be really using AI for very specific purposes can be really useful, right?
Mm.
So learning to write prompts, for instance, is something that people want to learn to do now. How do I write a good prompt? How do I, do this? And that is a writing activity. It's a rhetorical situation. Um, I don't know how quickly that's going to come. And I do think, to your point, I think there will be distributed versions of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there are disciplinary specific kinds of tools. So if you're in business and you need to write an email or an executive summary or
Yeah.
something like that, one of the big things you're concerned about is if you are using AI, you want to use it in a way that is correct, that the output is
Accurate.
correct. Yeah.
Yep.
Accuracy.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
output is accurate and that you're engaging actively with it. So I think learning that process, I mean, the places where students tend to uh, not succeed, I don't want to use the right words there, um, is when they don't engage with it, they don't engage critically at all.
Yeah.
They're
So
like,
so
write this
part
thing
of
for
it,
me, and then suddenly they've got gibberish
And
that
then
has like made up
and they'll
yeah.
hand it
sentences.
in without
Yeah,
looking
and
at
it's
it.
like,
Yeah.
wow, Voltaire wrote this. Who
So you
knew?
can you can teach critical thinking, right, as part
Yeah.
of this sort of process.
Yes, for sure. For sure. That's a big part of it, is how to
Right.
engage with this. I mean, writing has been influenced by the tools that we use always, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, when we suddenly had computers, which sadly I'm old enough to remember.
That's okay. I
That
remember
We all are.
I had a tablet. I had a tablet and this chisel, and I broke it when I fell off my dinosaur. So,
exactly. So, but that changed things. That changed
Sure.
fundamental
Spell
things.
check
Spell
became
check,
a thing.
being able
Yeah.
to cut and paste, being able to, these are things. You remember, like, you'd have to like correct things like line by line with tape. I mean, the way you were invested in the permanence of something changed completely when you could just manipulate the text in these ways. So this is different. I'm not saying it's the same kind of revolution, but the tools that we use to engage with writing have always changed, and we have to figure out how critically to engage with them so that the human beings who are involved are still doing the critical thinking and engaging with those tools in ways that are like really meaningful.
That's a question I have for you. Maybe this is a sidebar, maybe it's directly related, but do you have to police the stuff that gets turned in? Do you still have a role? And I suspect that any good leader, manager who's looking at, even in a business situation, the content that's created, making sure it's on brand, like we said earlier, accurate. But what are you experiencing with that whole, like, there's got to be a little bit of like sheriff in you still, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big question, and in the
I
same
have
way
lots of big questions.
Yeah, I know, me too. And I don't know if I have big answers, but in the same way that there's a range of folks who teach writing feel every one of these ways about AI. There are people who are, we are not going to use this, and they have a lot of different reasons for that. Some of which are about skill building and critical thinking. Some of which are about the ethics of how the tools are created and produced. Copyright issues with energy, all of those things. There are a lot of reasons why people are like, I do not want to engage. And then there's all the way to the other end of the spectrum where it's like, I am all in. I'm somewhere in the middle area.
Yep.
And the same is true with the idea of policing. And I think the fundamental answer for me is no. I don't want to spend my time and energy trying to figure out if every single piece of text that's turned into me is written by AI.
Is there an AI tool for that?
Probably.
So there is, but they're terrible. And I will tell you why, because this is important. There are detection tools. Every company that's ever made something for plagiarism detection is now marketing something for AI detection. And there are equity issues with this. There are so many problems with the way the tools are now. I will not speak to how they will be forever.
What do you mean by equity issues? Just if I can.
Well, for instance, they tend to do I'm not going to be able to do the technical stuff. I'm going to do the really most simplistic.
That's okay.
No, absolutely.
Sure.
They work by prediction, right?
Yeah.
So essentially, if the writing is really predictable, if the word choice is really predictable, if the structures are really predictable. So if ChatGPT creates a 5-paragraph essay, it has all of the prediction.
So behind the scenes,
markers,
it
right?
is, this is the way
exactly
an algorithm.
But it's the most likely version.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay.
So it'll have like in conclusion at the end.
Yeah. And, yeah. Right.
And
all those
proof
markers.
Points for every paragraph. And
exactly.
Yeah.
But how have many of our high school students been taught to write?
Like that.
Like that.
In that structure.
Like that.
Yeah.
Right. So those tools will identify, and I guess the equity piece comes in, especially students who have come from really rigid programs or programs where they don't have a lot of experience with developing their own particular critical point of view, or they've been given really strong formulas. It will identify those students as writing with AI. And I know that students sometimes run their own stuff through, they've written it themselves through an AI detector. It comes back as AI. And then they go back in and they try to un-AI it. Which is not a good use of anyone's time.
Right.
That's pretty funny.
Yeah.
Well, I've used it to be like, hey, clean this up for grammar or whatever.
Right.
You know?
And my students do use it in the places where they see value for it. I mean, and we forget that things like Grammarly
Mm-hmm.
is a tool that's been around for a really long time and does
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
very similar things. My students do see value there. I worry about that in terms of voice.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
So there are kinds of writing where your voice doesn't matter. You know, if
Mm-hmm.
you're writing
Communications.
an email or
Yeah.
something that's very flat. But if you're writing something where I would much rather have something that has errors
Mm-hmm.
and all sorts of different like inventive word usage and things that are
Mm-hmm.
not technically correct
Mm-hmm.
than have something that is incredibly bland and sounds
And
like
Right.
like
yeah,
perfect grammatically. That's
yeah,
fair.
The
grammatically
definition of
flat.
true creative writing, right? Sorry, I didn't
Yeah,
mean to talk over you,
yeah,
but
Yeah.
yeah.
And
Voice matters.
how are your colleagues? Where do they fall in the spectrum of into it or not?
All of those places,
Mm-hmm.
and that's one of the things that's really makes this a very interesting time to be doing the work that we do, because we're developing policies that in some ways are not policies. Our policies are sort of like do what you're going to do, but be clear with your students,
right.
Mm-hmm.
um, so that they understand what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a lot of curiosity across the spectrum for understanding all the varied ways that we're using AI in our classrooms and the reasons why some folks do not. So, and I have colleagues who are doing really like very creative things where they're having their students work with bots that they've created or, like who are
Mm-hmm.
completely doing things that I can't do and don't know how to do. I'd like to learn,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't know how. So everybody's sort of all along that
Mm-hmm.
spectrum.
Kind of fascinating. Where do you think things are
Yeah.
going to go? Oh, go ahead,
Yeah,
Simon.
I was gonna ask that question. It's sort of
Okay.
like, where is this? Where's the trend gonna go? And specifically in your space for writing, but in academia, what do you think next couple 5 years kind of thing?
Yeah.
What would you hope happens, right?
That might be a better question.
Besides,
Okay.
robots taking over the
That's easier
world.
to answer. Yeah. I don't
Sorry,
want
yeah.
No.
We don't want
don't want the robots to
Terminator.
take over.
Yeah, exactly. I'll be back.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of things I would hope happen. I think one of the things I worry about is that all of the tools are becoming increasingly integrated into everything that we do, and they're going to become increasingly invisible. So
Mm.
if I go to Copilot and it says, "Hi, can I help you write this? Do you want to write a paper? What can I do to help you?" That's kind of hard to ignore and be
Right.
like,
Yeah.
"No, I'd really like to do this myself."
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the other day, as I said, I when I open academic articles now, I often get a box that says, "Would you like me to summarize this for you?"
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that's sort of a perfect example of where the tension is. Right? I'm gonna use that as an example. The Most people don't want to summarize. Like summarizing is not
Oh,
a
yeah.
task
No.
that most people want to
Especially
do,
if it's a
right?
contract that you're reading, it's like, ugh, just give me
Yeah.
the
Give me
highlights.
the
Yeah.
high points, right?
Mm-hmm.
But from my perspective, it's also an important skill because, like,
Mm.
say you're reading academic literature, you're reading dense, rigidly structured, something that's very specific to your particular discipline. Like, say you're someone who's studying physical therapy and you need to learn about ACL repair, and there's 1,000 articles. Um, there's a lot of tools now that I think are going to be very useful for navigating that space. There's a lot of AI tools for coordinating research, finding networks
Mm.
between articles, making all of that part of the process more efficient. And I do think there's a space for having something be summarized for you. But I also think there's a skill to reading an article like that
Mm.
that's important. And if you don't have that skill, then you're going to always be relying on something else to tell you what it's about or what it means or what is important,
Right.
and not making those distinctions yourself. So
Mm.
that's where I struggle, is like a lot of it is about what we value and what we want to spend our time with. But then how do we develop some of the skills that are maybe not so fun, but that later kind of are useful?
Mm-hmm.
How do we navigate the space? And because it's all about, like, exactly what you said before. If I can outsource these things, I can be more creative, right? But if you're a writer, if you don't do all the messy, boring developmental stuff, it's really hard to get to a place where you can be creative.
Mm.
So how do we continue to teach in a way that recognizes the tools and the way that they're used, and that our students are going to need these skills? This isn't going anywhere.
Yep.
Right.
Exactly.
But still build their skills as they go through, so they're not like skipping big developmental chunks.
It in a really simplified world, it made me start to think about still teaching kids multiplication tables, still teaching kids how to spell, right? I'm a terrible speller. So like Lisa said, thanks for spell check.
Yeah.
But the point is, you still need to understand how to try to spell it or sound a word out or quickly do, math. I always joke that I do marketing math. I have kids that do calculus and all kinds of crazy stuff that I don't understand, but I can give me some numbers and I can tell you the
Numerator and a
percentage.
denominator.
Yeah, I can tell you what the increase was, what the
What the
change
lift
was.
is.
Yeah, and do it in my head really fast, right? Or summarize a bunch of numbers in a spreadsheet. So it's to your point, that's a really simplified version of what you're talking about in the classroom, especially at the collegiate, and it sounds like the research level and things like that, right? I don't want someone summarizing how to cure cancer to then treat me.
Right.
I will say though, the summary is like, again, if it's something as a slog, and maybe like I used a contract as an example, I don't know that I need to have that as a skill. And I wonder if there's people who have a hard time, reading long form. And if you can get a summary, maybe it's giving them the opportunity to participate. Yeah. Just like with generative art, like it's allowing people to participate in that.
I think the opportunity too is that, like in that contract example, it might highlight something, or in your research paper, all of a sudden it pops something up and you're like, that's interesting, right? And then how do you go from that summary back into, say, that portion of the article?
Right. And that's the key. And I think it's not, again, these tools really are useful, right? And especially say you have to read like 100 of these, right? And that, I mean, technically abstracts kind of do the same thing, but I did do not an experiment, but I had my students in my advanced writing class try a tool called Docalysis, which is essentially, it does this, it analyzes scholarly articles. And I didn't give them much instruction. I just said, ask for a summary and then read it. Don't read it first. Like, ask for a summary first and then read it.
The summary.
And then talk about what you see.
Ask for the summary, read the article, and then look at the summary?
No, they could look at the summary first, but
don't read the article.
Don't read the article first. Like, so they just asked for a summary, read the summary, and then they read the article. And I wanted to know, I was just genuinely curious, like, how did it do? Did it do a good job of summarizing, the article in ways that would be useful to you? And on that first pass, most of them said no. Like, not that it was bad. They weren't wrong per se, but that it didn't do anything that the abstract didn't already do. It didn't highlight information
wasn't helpful,
that was useful to them. But some of the students, and maybe this is more to the point, went further and they said, okay, give me an extended summary, or give me a summary of the results, and they started to ask different kinds of questions. And for the students who did that, then they ended up in a place where they did have information. So maybe it's more about, again, learning to use the tool,
that engagement,
in a way that's productive.
I think again, this is where humans come in, and the idea that you have a 2.5 hour video to watch, but you don't care about groundwater like discussions, you want to hear about this grant for housing, right? So
Right.
you say, hey, find this, this part of the conversation about housing, and then summarize that. So
Right. Yeah, and
Your
that's
examples are
making a
funny.
specific one, a
I do
Yeah,
funny
specific
stuff.
his,
task.
yeah. Simon comes up with them, and I literally am like, I'm like looking around, like, where could he have, like, are you looking outside and seeing a puddle of water, or like how?
That's just the
Where are
way
you
my
coming up with
mind
these?
works.
Yeah, I know. What are some of the tools that you use?
So it was funny. I was thinking about this, and I don't use many, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, so for me to do, like, I've played with some of the visual generators, and I find
Mm-hmm.
those super fun.
Mm-hmm.
And
Which
I try
ones? You
to,
can name them. Go ahead.
so like Dolly, Firefly.
Mid Journey.
I haven't used Midjourney because
Mm.
you got to pay for it
You
eventually.
do have to pay for it now.
Um,
It's annoying.
but ChatGPT does images now, and
Mm-hmm.
what do you call it? Copilot also has an image
Mm-hmm.
generator. Um, and I've thought about the fact that I find that really fun because it's in a space where I'm not comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
I try to extend that to my students who they probably find ChatGPT and other kinds of writing tools really helpful because it's a space where they're not comfortable, and it makes
Yep.
them
Right.
feel more comfortable and more sort of, it can make them feel more confident. But I haven't found the application of a tool that's going to make my life more efficient, because
Mm.
I mean, the
Mm-hmm.
thing for me that takes the most amount of time is reading student writing
Mm-hmm.
and assessing and offering feedback and
Have you
talking to
ever
students about that.
uploaded
And I
a Have you ever
mm-mm,
uploaded a student document, and
I have not.
why?
What do you mean uploaded? You mean within
I've
So
a
had it.
yeah,
what do you mean?
I take for example, I when I do this mock interview process with these guys trying to get back in the workforce, I'll take a job description, I'll take their resume, and I have a roughly structured prompt, and upload those documents and create interview questions. So it's looking at their resume, and it also gives feedback on the resume, like
Right.
based on the fact that they want this job, because resumes should be optimized to jobs, right? And things like that.
Right.
So I wonder, have you been tempted? Have you ever thought about testing or,
I have not. I mean, I think for one thing, our program has a specific policy not to do that.
okay,
I mean, as output. I mean, there's nothing to say you couldn't do it to play,
try
right?
it.
But we have a specific policy not to outsource student feedback and student
Mm-hmm.
assessment. And I
Mm-hmm.
think some of that is because so much of in writing, particularly, this is different, I think, in other disciplines and in other situations, obviously.
Hmm.
But a lot of the work that we're doing is very much in, we don't have a set, we have a rubric maybe, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that rubric might be like, uses your voice effectively,
Mm.
right? And
Yeah.
so if I put my rubric into the thing, and then I put the students' work into the thing, I'm sure it can come up with a score or an assessment, but it
Mm.
has no context for that. It has no context for the conversations we've had in class, or the discussion I've had with the student, or the process of revision
Context.
I've seen them
Right.
do, which is what I tend to value, is sort of how they're moving
Yeah.
through
How
that
did they
Yeah.
process.
evolve?
I mean, sort
Right.
of
That's a
what
good
you're being
point.
paid for and what your experience is being paid for, right? Is
100%.
yeah.
It's the human. I like to believe it's the human value
But
in
I think
Yeah.
it's a really great example of something that can't initial. I mean, I won't say can't because it's
oh,
possible,
it
but
can be, yeah.
yeah, but you wouldn't want it. You wouldn't want to outsource that, right?
No, because and it would eliminate, um, I guess, essentially everything that I value
Right.
in the whole process, right? It's certainly
Mm.
possible to, and I do know that people are doing interesting work with creating bots that do very specific kinds of writing feedback. And I do think
Mm.
that could be useful. Like if you're writing a resume, or if you're writing a
Hmm.
lab report, or if you're writing um, a lit review, those are very structured things, and they have
And kind
very
of
specific.
repeatable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you can folks are creating bots that can give advice on those elements, like, is this an accurate summary, or, that kind of thing, or does this
Mhm.
have the components that are needed for this? And I haven't played with those. That would interest me, like
Mm-hmm.
how those
How,
are
and
developed.
then how did you get involved? Were you just like, oh, this is a thing that's happening, and then you just sort of jumped in because you were curious, or like, how did it even start? Did you read books about it or anything? Are there books? Is that a thing?
Yeah, there
What's a
Okay.
book? Wait, what's a
there are
book?
books,
What is
there
that
are
a thing?
articles.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Articles. Yeah.
yeah, no, I think it was more so. I don't know how this played out in other fields, but
Mm-hmm.
in writing, this was an explosion. This was like,
Right.
Mm-hmm.
okay, are we going to have jobs anymore? Are
Mm-hmm.
students going to be doing, just using AI to write? Is nobody going to ever think again? And a lot of the rhetoric was very like panic driven. And I didn't see it. I mean, I found it sort of fascinating. It was the first time I played with ChatGPT. I was like, wait, what?
Yeah. I think we all were like that.
Crazy. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was more interested. I was really interested in what was going to change. I was really interested in how we can adapt, um, because people are still going to need to write. So
Mm-hmm.
if we've got new tools, then we've got to figure out how we're going to work with, around, through, all of those things with those tools. So I was really just curious, and we did a lot of work in our program at the very beginning, to develop like a bank of readings, a whole collection of readings with different
Mm-hmm.
perspectives, to come up with like a general policy, to
Mm.
try to navigate like that early space, and to actually come up with really pragmatic ideas for how to people could work in the classroom. Like, what are some assignments you can do? Like, how do you engage
Mm-hmm.
with this? So for me anyway, all of that was really interesting and remains really interesting.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. We live in fascinating times. I guess
Yeah.
I want to close with just one last question because you're working with students, you have your colleagues that you work with, but then if you think about people going out into the workforce and diving into AI. And as you know, we focus on mostly marketing here. And so, Simon and I will give tips to people that on like how to get started with things. Do you have any advice to people on how to get started and the things to watch out for, I guess, when using AI, just in general?
um I think the how to get started is to play. Do it yourself. Play with
Mm-hmm.
tools, play around with them, see what they do, see what the limitations are. I do think reading, around is great. Ted Chiang has a great article called, ChatGPT is a blurry JPEG of the web. That is
Interesting.
fantastic on like the relationship between, these tools and like creativity. So it would be something that would work in almost any creative endeavor. So I think playing around, being open, listening to what people are talking about, not panicking, and
That's
still
good
being sort
advice.
of aware
Yeah.
is good. But I do think that the when you go out there into the real world piece is important. Not that I'm not in the real world, but
Sure.
but when you're in a setting where there is output that is going to go to other people, this is true in academia. That's true in a work setting. Um, you have got to have the critical skills to examine the rhetorical situation,
Mm-hmm.
to examine what the expectations are, for what this piece is supposed to sound like, look like, um, do in that space.
Mm-hmm.
And you also are always, always accountable, regardless of what tool you use for the output. So
Mm.
if you don't do the work to make sure that it's accurate, that it's correct, that it follows the rhetorical conventions of, if you're writing an email, it should sound like an email that works in
Mm-hmm.
your workplace and your work environment.
Right.
If you're writing a report, you should definitely read a whole bunch of other reports that do that work before you just tell a tool to create that thing. So as the human, you have to be just sort of aware of the fact that this is a tool and you're still responsible for the output of the tool, no matter how you use it.
I think that's a really good point that I hadn't heard. It's the human responsibility, right? That's, there's all of the precaution to make sure it's accurate, make sure it's, especially in a business situation, you don't want to give something that might change the course of a small business or a business, whatever. But it's also on you. This is on you to do your homework first, use the tools wisely, I guess, and then check it. Like right? We always say trust and verify, or verify and trust. I can't remember which order it is, but you probably should do
verify.
both. Yeah. So.
Yep. Well, Kelly, this has been a pleasure, and we thank you so much for your time. And we're just going to sign off with one last thing. Simon, why don't you start?
Well, from tangents to tactics,
it's mostly marketing.